really, it was Michael Soule who was the one that was credited with terming or coining the term conservation biology in the 80s. And really, of course, it was a couple decades before that Tom Cade and the founders of the Peregrine Fund were already really launching this, what would be this epic, successful conservation biology project, which, you know, the key element of conservation biology is to not just study an animal and know why it's declining, but to really implement a restoration plan and actually implement it successfully. So not just enough to know the basic descriptive biology, you need to know why it's declining, and you need to figure out how you can recover it. And what's new to that phenomenon is a third component, which is the human element, to change human behavior. We can know all the things we need to know. We can know how to recover a species, but it's not enough if the population at a whole is not, changing. So, out of breath. So for that reason, what's so unusual about Chris is that he brings all three of those elements, a mastery of all three of those elements in his professional career, and he is the new CEO of the Peregrine Fund. So please welcome Chris.
Sure. Well, thank you. I'm trying some new things of late, and I'm going to continue that by choice. Last time I talked to you fine folks, I was talking to you about the California condor and how studying that bird we've learned about lead poisoning and then what we've done to address the lead poisoning issue. I'm really happy to be here and be asked to be here, so thank you for that, John. I appreciate it. And to share with you exploring global falconry heritage and what that means to conservation and what that means to the Peregrine Fund. I've been asked by some of you here, and when I took this position of what is the future of falconry and the Peregrine Fund? Well, the future is the same as our heritage, and it remains to be a big part. And I'm going to share with you my perception of falconry as one that maybe, I don't know, I think maybe I was born a falconer, except I'm not a falconer. I was introduced to falconry by a lot of folks that I will mention, not to name drop, but to give you an idea of how my appreciation for our hunting heritage has led to the way I do business and conservation, which luckily has aligned philosophically with those who hired me, and now here I am as president and CEO. Also acknowledge that the two hardest times to both give and hear a presentation are high and low blood sugar, so I will try to make it quick. Some of the things the challenges I didn't do willingly, like not have slides. I think I had 67 slides for my 20-minute talk last time. I asked John, I said, can I switch it up and not do slides? I just want to have a conversation. I want people to hear it the way I feel it. And even though I write things down, chances of me sticking to this script are slim to none. So I've learned a lot from the presentations here today. I've learned, and I've always known that I don't know anything. So that's great. And I have all of you to ask. And so consider this an ask for when I do finally build that mew and I get my first bird. Just go ahead and assume this is my asking for your advice. So feel free to give it when I enter that phase of my life. Hope I live long enough to do all of these things. I'm going to give you an overview first, and I was writing this so that I would at least get this in there before I go off on some tangent. I'm blessed by association of falconers and being introduced, and I'm ruined by the passion and the enthusiasm that follows after being exposed to folks like Bill Burnham, Tom Cade, Pete Widener, Bob Berry, Paul Juergens, Brian Mutch. Those people are on my first outing in Sheridan, Wyoming, and that was my first exposure. Knowing a falcon is knowing a landscape, knowing any bird. And despite my wildlife management, wildlife biology training, you can't know a bird by just studying in the classroom. And to know a bird because you're a falconer, you see the landscape differently. I've had over 2 decades now involved with these fine people, with the Peregrine Fund, and I was really hit as a biologist for the Arizona Game and Fish Department at the delisting ceremony where Tom Cade gave his call to arms, and he quoted Ulysses. I won't try to requote that because I messed it up. And then most of my experience and how I've used what I've learned from our heritage in falconry and the way we do business and the tenacity that it takes. Most of what I know comes from working with the California condor. These birds, all of those that we study globally at the Peregrine Fund, continue to teach us about the landscape. And that's great because we can use our foundation in science and we can establish that as our base, and then we move forward and try and translate that science to the masses so that we can do effective conservation. That's our goal. Lead exposure, of course, is one of those things. I'm a lifelong hunter and angler, and little did I know until we were studying this at some of the very ranches up in Sheridan where I first went hawking. We were studying the effects of lead, or the fragmentation of lead, trying to answer the question, where were these scavenging birds getting that lead? And then finally, the foundation in science. I already mentioned that. See, I jump ahead. And then conservation. Knowing isn't enough. We have to not only share it so that it is known, we have to inspire so that the changes necessary to ameliorate the problems that we identify with our science happen. We have to incite that change. And people only preserve and cherish what they know, and if they love what they know, they will do things, major things, like changing long-held, multi-generational sometimes habits. So with all that, that's really the presentation. And unlike many of you who were introduced at a young age, I was not. I mentioned those folks that I am close to, and I'll tell you this, that some of the most respected falconers that I hear now that I've done the reading and been around for 22 years, some of those very experienced falconers said, nah, don't do it. Just go out with Brian and Paul and those guys. Let them handle it all. So I still do that every year. I'm in the field hawking with those guys, and I love it. My dealings with the Peregrine Fund showed me from those early years is what was unique about Bill Burnham and Tom Cade and these other falconers is that they knew the landscape and the ecosystem through the eyes of their birds. Not just because they monitored and watched their birds, but they knew how they were going to interact with the landscape. You can't teach that in school, and that's always been fascinating to me. The difference to most was probably nearly imperceptible, and some surely miss it. But I knew during my first trip afield as a young biologist with Bill and Jeff Seelick down in Condor land in Arizona, when I met them and I saw their demeanor and the way they interacted with people, I thought, that's a group that I need to get to know. Because if I work with them, even as a cooperating biologist for the department at Arizona Game and Fish, I would see success. Because they had tenacity that was different than any of the other state or federal partners that I had worked with so far. That came from their willingness, their knowledge to tackle challenges that seemed insurmountable. And then I find myself 10, 15 years later working for the Peregrine Fund and faced with lead poisoning, which we have now come to understand is the limiting variable for the recovery of the California condor and very likely the cause of its near extinction, down to 22 individual birds. Beyond the textbooks, hidden within the understanding of the birds and with the confidence of knowing that you all right here sitting in this room and so many more did prevent an extinction of a species and recovered a species. Something very, very, very little known, what it takes to recover a species. And those that are recovered, we tend to lose that generation to generation. I hear people talk about bald eagles now and they say, well, lead poisoning can't be a problem. Look how many of them there are. We don't celebrate our successes enough. We, of course, celebrate the challenges, and we are eager to greet them, just like Tom told us to, but we don't celebrate, and we therefore lose that generationally if we don't tell the stories of how we nearly lost them, and more importantly, how we saved them. We have to know the landscape. What I've learned through these 2 decades in my personal experience and my readings is that we must continue to meet the many challenges, as Tom had suggested. My journey and my understanding of what our heritage in falconry, combined with our science and applying it to conservation and using the California condor for my experience is what has led me here today. And of course, I have to talk about lead and condors because I have you all here. We have 110 condors in the population in northern Arizona and southern Utah. 110, with over a half a dozen of the F2 generation. They will, in fact, breed in the wild. You don't have to teach them. All falconers probably knew that, didn't they? And the point of it is that, yes, that's quite an accomplishment in and of itself, but what we're looking for is a self-sustaining population. To see them recovered to the point where in my time for those 20 years in the Grand Canyon, I could hear Tom Cade telling me when I surveyed the Grand Canyon in X year and I saw no peregrines, and then the last time I did, I saw them every 2 miles. Success is possible. And we can see that with the condors. But we have to do this again. We have to learn how to translate the findings in our science, make that digestible to the masses, not just the hunters. Of course, the hunters are the only ones that can solve this problem, but we have equal, if not more, work to do with the non and especially the anti-hunting community. This is where the heritage of falconry and the Peregrine Fund really came through. We launched the North American Non-Lead Partnership. We were able to do that because of our heritage, because we are hunters talking to fellow hunters, and because we are revered scientists who have recovered a species like the peregrine falcon. That enables us to talk both to the hunters and the non-hunters and even the anti-hunters. To give all of those pause to say, if you give us some time, now I'm talking about anti-hunters, if you give us some time, we will and we can solve this problem. And here's our proof. And we go back through history. And we go across the globe and talk about whether it's diclofenac in India, whether it's furadan in Africa. All of these things are anthropogenically sourced causes of mortality and morbidity. Who the hell knows what that is unless we translate it? We have to translate it. And when we do, and when we share with them that anybody can do this, a kid from Buttonwillow, California can do this. That empowers them, and they see the science as it relates to their lives, and we have to be able to relate to them. Conservation, I just decided to skip the rest because I think I've said it. Conservation is about conversations, and I always get those mixed up. But if we're not conversing about our experiences and sharing our knowledge, then we won't see our goals. And more importantly, it'll be lost with us in a generation or 2 or 3. Things are changing so rapidly. Science, of course, always changes, and that's a fantastic world to live in, but cultures change rapidly. The means of communication today are different than ever before. We have to figure out how to communicate and convey that passion so that we can continue to make the world a fit place, just like Tom said. With that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. We have time for several questions.
Don't ask how we're going to do this. We're working on that. Any questions? Yes, sir.
What's your perspective on this kind of globally and nationally? I think I'm usually loud enough. I don't need a microphone.
If you would, please. For the
Okay. With your perspective globally and nationally on this, we've had several recent concerns expressed over populations of Swainson's hawks, kestrels. Just seems like various raptors all over the country, different times and different isolated locations. In your opinion, which one of is there a raptor in the U.S. that you think is on the horizon as our next serious concern? I mean, which one is it that raises your hackles on the back of your neck more than any other right now, as far as U.S. raptors?
Wow. Whew, yeah, I'll be the first to tell you. I don't know enough to probably answer that question, but we have some people on our staff and many collaborators that could probably give you a much better answer. But I will answer the question with an observation, and that is we are breaking out of the single species. We would like to break out of the single species conservation efforts and study ecosystems and as a whole. We're talking about lead poisoning, for example, not because it uniquely affects condors. We're talking about lead poisoning because it's an ecosystem health issue that can be improved for all those species. Another example I'll give you, what I first thought of is studying species while they're common. There's a lot of value in that. Think about the kestrel. There are regional declines of the kestrel that are real indices of landscape scale change. that we can learn from. And we have the American Kestrel Partnership, and we're working through means of citizen science to collect data. And all the while we're doing things like that, we're increasing the capacity and learning within the communities where we work. And I think studying humans is probably going to give us more than worrying about the single species. Because the humans, while they can be the problem, they are also the solution. So studying more broadly and holistically in a landscape scale, I think for me is my focus. Now, I didn't answer your question, and I'll find somebody who can give you a much better answer than I, but I think it's the relationship we have with the environment and learning about all species, especially those that are terribly accessible, because that's where the relevancy can start. Yes, sir. They're going to make you get a mic, boss. You can flip. Now he's got one here. I'll come to you next, sir. Thank you.
All right.
Yes, sir.
Where are things at on getting the lead under control? Do you have an idea of how things have progressed?
You bet. I'll give you a few case in point examples that have given us the confidence from our small scale programs that large scale program success is possible. Many people want to jump immediately to, what about the legislation? Do we have bans in place? Because they use that as an indicator of success. I'm very leery of that, because a ban and a change of ink on paper doesn't mean you solve the problem. It means you have a ban now. And oftentimes it means you have a bunch of pissed off hunters. Our approach is a little different. And the way we've done it is by building collaboratively these relationships with individual hunters, hunting groups, and wildlife management agencies, by sharing the information that we've gleaned about lead exposure, its impact on some species like the condor, and then what we can do to solve it. Arizona Game and Fish is my best case in point. They have started programs since 2005 when we shared with them our fragmentation study, and we said, would you share this with hunters and ask them for their help? They not only did that, but they incentivized a program by offering free lead ammunition to the kaibab deer hunters. After 3 years of that program, we've maintained for over a decade 87% annual participation. That suggested to me that philosophy and that approach could work, and we needed to do it on a landscape scale. 2018 is when we launched the North American Non-Lead Partnership, and while we spent our first 2 years operating entirely on unrestricted funding, I thank the board and the previous president for allowing us to do that. Now, rather than us going out and standing at the North American conference and talking about non-lead and saying, hey, we're hunters, we're talking about lead, now wildlife management agencies and sports groups are calling us to say, how do we develop a program in our region? So the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies in the Northeast and the Midwest are now partners, and we're beginning to develop programs where we can do the outreach necessary to them develop programs to begin seeing the decreases. Again, that doesn't answer your question either. If we're using, it depends on the metrics we're using to monitor our success. If we're using condors, it's probably the most sensitive, not because they're more sensitive to lead, but because they're an obligate scavenger, they're more predisposed to getting it. When we look at the percentage of people using non-lead after being contacted and asked, it's looking great. But the lead poisoning obviously hasn't gone away, and some of our colleagues just published in Science here a few weeks back with Vincent Slaby and Todd Katzner about eagle declines, 3.8% limit on productivity for bald eagles, and a 1% limit in productivity and increase by golden eagles. That has gotten a lot of attention. It's also gotten a lot of attention of people who think they do conservation with legislation and threats of litigation. So we're deep in that quagmire as well. I think it's getting better, and that comes from 20 years of talking about this issue. It does seem to be getting better, but the first step is aligning philosophically that there's a problem worth solving and that we can solve it. Then we have to go take action. It's kind of like a diet plan, and I always say that. I know the equation for weighing 295 pounds. It's not that I don't understand the science, but making change is the difficulty, and that's what we have to do, inspire that change, and I think we're seeing the beginnings of that. Sorry for the long answer. I don't know how to answer that shortly. This one over. Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, just real quick, can you share your personal falconry experience?
Zero. I've helped to rehab a few birds, and my falconry experience is every year hawking with two of my best buddies, Brian Mutch and Paul Juergens. That's my falconry experience. I have observed what I have come to understand is pretty damn good falconry. Yes. Do we have time for one more? One more here.
Hi. I really was impressed with your observations on the cultural side of things. All of us in this room, there's so many of us that are older that we've seen in 50, 60, 70 years in some cases, say with Mr. Carney. We've seen the changes. I mean, if you were out on the prairies in the 60s, agriculture was inefficient. There was always lots of grain left in the field. There was lots of cover. And then we got more efficient. And the culture within the farming community itself has changed. And so getting the people that are on that land to think differently. I went to a conference up in Nebraska just a few weeks ago that was basically, it was by the Upland Game people, Upland Game Project. It was like a trade show for upland game hunters. Everybody is absolutely crazy over the decline in the upland game. And so much of it is tied to the agricultural practices. And now things are starting to pop out, just like it did with our peregrines with the chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticides.
Right.
There's stuff out there that they're thinking is causing the decline in grouse. Steve Chingren, the expert on sage grouse. All the other guys here that are grouse hawkers. Everybody this time of the year, we're what? We go out to the leks to see what's the count this year. I haven't talked to anybody where the lek count isn't down. Why?
Yeah.
Why? So in addition to what the Peregrine Fund is doing for the apex predators, so to speak, when I first went to my first NAFA meet in 1966, we were down to a handful of birds that were there at the meet that were falcons. Now we got lots of falcons. We got nothing to fly them at. So part of what you guys are doing, I think you ought to also turn to that side of it. And culturally, I'm originally from Indiana. In Indianapolis, we host the Future Farmers of America convention every year. Wow. If we hit the kids, what do you think the odds are that if a child goes home and tells his dad, I want to see pheasants and grouse on our place again. And the old man, he's been doing what? He wants another 5 bushels an acre. That's what the old man wants.
Yep.
So, and that old man was the son of the guy that I first met in 1966 out on the prairies of Kansas.
Right.
So this cultural thing is real. And I thought with the way you stated it and the way you presented it is a seminal idea for how we should approach this. Because when you try to do things through legislation, people resent being forced to do things.
Yep.
When you change their hearts and they want to do something,
You're hired.
then it keeps on going. Then it keeps on.
You're hired. Go see the World Center for Birds of Prey and you'll see. One last thing. Tate Mason is here, our director at the World Center for Birds of Prey. We share a hill together, the Archives of Falconry and the Peregrine Fund. When you go see the World Center for Birds of Prey and how we are engaging young people, I hope that resonates, and thank you for those comments.